Hey there YouTube, I'm Ikitsu, this is the Ikitsu Times, welcome to my channel, and welcome to a little bit of Sins of Solar Empire 2. So today we're going to be talking about the Vigilis Sentinel, and this is the point defense ship for the Advent faction. It's a pretty good ship, and I think it's heavily underrated. A lot of Advent players will say that they don't think the Vigilis is any good, and then they won't build any of them, and then they get attacked by 100 Javelises, and they just die because Javelises, it turns out, are very high damaging ships. I actually really like the ship. I think it's extremely good. I think it's incredibly interesting in terms of where it sits in the way that the game works. And we'll get into a little bit about that later. So first of all, let's take a look at the stats here.
We are vigilant.
So for durability, we're looking at 300. We've got 1,250 shield points, 795 armor, and 1,100 hull points. For damage, we're looking at 7-point defense lasers at 2.5 base damage per second with 0 pierce. Total of 17.5 damage per second from the point defense guns there. And it's got 3 light lasers with 3 damage per second base at 100 pierce for 9 damage per second at 100 pierce. So the Vigilis Sentinel has got quite a good amount of total hull points there. For hidden statistics, we're looking at an armor strength of 40 and a maximum speed of 775. All in all, I'd say that the ship for a cruiser at where it is actually remarkably tough. And then it's also got an okay amount of damage. If we're to compare it, it does a little bit more anti-ship damage than the Junstark Warden does for when we adjust for cost. A little bit less than the Garda Flak Frigate Mark II, but its point defense damage is a little bit lower than both of them when we adjust for supply. But it's in the same sort of ballpark as all of them. It's not really that far off of the others in terms of any of those numbers there. However, let's take a look at its cost here. I was sort of mentioning this. It costs 9 supply, and it costs 350 credits, 140 metal, and 45 crystal. The price in credits is really low for the Vigilis, which is quite nice. However, it is very metal expensive. Crystal is pretty medium in terms of the cost for that, but very, very, very metal expensive. It's also quite expensive for what it is in terms of supply, but it's still pretty comparable in terms of that compared to the Garda Flak Frigate or the Junstark Warden. So what exactly makes this ship interesting to me? I was sort of mentioning this. It's the fact that it's a cruiser with 300 durability and a lot of hit points with good armor. If you were to compare this to the Garda Flak Frigate or the Junstark Warden, the 2 dedicated point defense ships for the other 2 factions, the really important thing about the Vigilis is that it's really hard to kill it with basic frigates. If you've got a bunch of Cobalts, Disciples, or Vestra Skirmishers, and they're trying to go and kill a whole bunch of point defense ships, they'll quickly and easily wipe out things like the Garda Flak Frigate, which has got 200 durability but very low other statistics there. Its hit points is quite low. Those will roll over those Garda Flak Frigates incredibly, incredibly quickly. They can roll over the Junstark Wardens relatively quickly because they'll be in slightly lower numbers, but they're still durability 200 and they're still relatively low hit points. They have way better hit points than the Garda Flak Frigates, but not enough to survive that kind of situation. The Vigilis, especially if it's being defended by an Iconis Guardian, is practically immune to that sort of situation there. It's taking half damage thanks to its higher durability. It's got a much, much wider hit point pool, and there's a lot of things that Advent are very good at for keeping their tougher ships alive for way longer. And as a result, you could send in a big blob of those sort of light frigates, and it wouldn't put a scratch on the Vigilis numbers. And as a result, you'd keep your point defense numbers up for a really long time. Now, the Garda Flak Frigate, the Junstark Warden, and the Vigilis all do kind of okay damage into those kinds of 100 durability targets. They all have a 100 pierce weapon with relatively low inefficient numbers. But because the Vigilises are keeping alive throughout that entire fight, and they're practically invincible to that sort of situation there, not really, but virtually, you're in a situation where the Vigilises are going to actually win that fight, whereas the Garda Flak Frigate or the Junstark Warden, they actually lose that fight. So what do you actually have to use to kill the Vigilis? Well, you have to use things like the Harka Heavy Cruiser, the Exoria, or the Cortova Suppressor. And the Cortova Suppressor is the only ship in the game that's truly efficient into the Vigilis. The Exoria has a little bit too much pierce, and they're a little bit wonky to use against lighter targets, because you sort of have to get into the middle of all of them so you can fire off all 3 beams. It's not really great otherwise. The Harka Heavy Cruiser is actually losing 33% of its damage, so it's actually going down to 16 damage per second. The Cortova Suppressor is the only thing that really hurts the Vigilis effectively. And in that particular case, the Cortova suppressor is so expensive that if you're massing those to the point where you can easily get rid of a whole bunch of Vigilises that are being like kind of babysat, you're in a situation where you're probably not building a giant wave of Canarech assailants. In which case, you don't have to go after the Vigilises, in which case, you don't need the Cortova suppressor for going after the Vigilises. So you're in a real bit of a pickle in that particular one there. Now, in that particular case, it is sort of true that if you have got a whole bunch of Canarech assailants and you see your opponent has got Vigilises, the sort of solution to that is to back out and then try and mass up enough Cortovises and hope that the Advent player doesn't build any Domina subjugators. Because if you're in that situation where they've got a bunch of Dominas and a bunch of Vigilises and you've got a bunch of Cortovises and a bunch of Canreks, you're hooped. The Advent player will actually just beat you there. But the sort of way that that dynamic works is kind of interesting in a lot of ways because the Advent player just doesn't have any damage in their fleet there. They're just chipping away with the Vigilises. But yeah, like it's hard to actually counter this. What are the other ships that would normally be able to bypass the durability that these guys have? What you're supposed to be able to do to get rid of 300 durability ships like the Javelus or the Exoria, you're supposed to be able to use things like bombers, or you're supposed to be able to use things like the Javelus or things like the Canarech Assailant. Those all have around the right amount of pierce to get through 300 durability. They all overshoot that by a little bit, but not enough to make it so that they're not a proper counter against that kind of ship. The problem is the Vigilis counters all of those because it's a point defense ship. It's the same reason you wouldn't use any of those ships into the Garda Flak frigate or into the Juncerek Warden. You would also potentially want to use something like the Stylat, which gets really, really badly bodied by the Vigilis because not only can the Vigilis easily kill it, but it's also blocking the missiles from it. So that is a terrible solution into the Vigilis Sentinel. So the ways to actually counter the ship are really narrow for a lot of factions. You can, of course, counter it with capital ships. That's one of the better ways to do it. But building your capitals around destroying the enemy point defense ships is kind of a weird thing to try to do, in all honesty. I think that's a little bit of a strange choice. The end result of this is I think that a lot of situations you're kind of forced to let the Vigilis do its thing, which means that you don't have the ability to sort of do the normal thing, which is you take a big wave of ships that are capable of destroying the point defense ships, and then you take a much larger wave of your missile ships, and you hunt down the enemy point defense ships, and then your missile ships are capable of doing their job. That's kind of the way that you want that to work. That doesn't work into the Vigilis. If you've got a situation where the opponent has got a whole bunch of these, and they've got like whatever else that they're protecting with the Vigilises, you send in your big wave of like ships to try and get rid of these guys. They just sort of tank through it and don't die. Especially if you're using like cleanse, you're using motherships, you're using guardians, whatever. Like they just are invincible, and then they just shove a whole bunch of like point defense in your face. So your missiles never actually get to do anything, or they last so long that you're almost guaranteed to lose all your missile ships before they're capable of doing anything functional either. So they're very, very tough to actually crack if you're trying to go for that sort of hybrid missile approach compared to the Garda Flak frigate or the Juncerek Warden. Now, it's absolutely still possible to go that route. It's definitely still possible to kill all the Vigilises and then use the missiles afterwards. But I would say that like it's way easier to do against the other factions. So let's go over the sort of research here. So nothing unique for this thing. I don't think there's any ships that like super synergize with the Vigilis, but it's definitely like a ship that is a support ship, so whatever else you're using. As far as the energy tree goes, the most important ones are going to be the laser upgrades here. Now, this is because of where this sits in where it goes there. If you're playing into a whole bunch of like missile ships, like your opponent just spammed out a whole ton of Canarech assailants, you've just made it into tier 3 and you decided to get a whole bunch of Vigilises, managed to hold out until you got them. The lasers are what helps you destroy their missiles faster, but also, you don't really care about the shields at that point in time because they've got a whole ton of missile ships and they're trying to shoot at the Vigilis with their missiles, and that doesn't work because you've got point defense. On the other hand, if your opponent went like Cortova suppressors or something like that, and they don't have any missile ships, while they could kill your Vigilises with those Cortovises, they probably won't bother. They'll probably go after your Exorias first because they don't have any missiles and they don't need to like bypass your point defenses. So it'd be a waste to go after these guys. It's only in that sort of hybrid approach that you have to think about the defenses first. And in that case, the missiles are still probably a priority you want to think about for these guys. So I would still say the laser upgrades first. But at that point in time, you're probably looking at getting the rotating. You're looking at getting the shield bonuses, the base value ones before the bursts. The burst is better though if you are taking incidental damage from enemy capitals, hitting them with their side guns or with area of effect attacks. In which case, being able to sort of cycle through those shield surges is better. For other bonuses in the substance tree, you're looking at, of course, the hull design ones. Those are kind of okay, but they come later. A little bit weaker than the shields, so you're going to want them, but they're not that crucial. And then the armor bonuses, again, which come way too late to be like easy to get, but you're going to want them eventually anyhow. For the Harmony tree, for Advent Reborn, you've got the Protection and Unity, which is kind of okay for these guys. They're tough and they like having extra shield regeneration, either if they're getting focused or if they're getting AoE'd. Works well for them either way, but it's not like gigantic. What really matters is actually the Fury of the Unity for Advent Wrath, which gives them that extra 20% damage in the super late game. This makes it so that the Vigilis is capable of outputting really, really heavy point defense damage into that late game and making it so that they can actually take out like very, very heavy fighters, especially if you're also combining that with your Unity abilities. Speaking of, let's get into that here. I think that the Vigilis is one of the best targets to use for cleanse, not only for keeping them alive, because they're a tough enough ship that you want to sort of like keep them alive, but they're also one of the best ships to actually like blow up using cleanse, because they give out a pretty good amount of both hull, shield, armor. All of that gets given out by the Vigilis, and because of that, you're getting a good value out of this. Their hit point values are quite good as well. I would say that they also don't overheal too much in the categories they have. If you've got a bunch of frigates around them and you're trying to heal those up, you're not going to overheal the shields or the armor by too much. You might overheal the hull value, but that's fine. It's also enough that you're also helping out your capital ships. If there's a bunch of them that are sort of, if there's one of them that's getting a little bit weakened, then you can use cleanse to make it so that your capital ship survives a little bit longer as well. Recall. Hypothetically, you can actually use recall for the exact same reason that you would on Tempest or the Aria drone host if you're getting hit by a bunch of raiders, but you come in so much later in the game with the Vigilis that it's much less likely that they're going to be able to use that effect, and they're also worse at that role by comparison, so the odds of this being a good choice for them is much lower. You would only use this if you want to recall your fleet for whatever reason. There is technically a thing that Sacrifice has going on for these guys. They're tough enough that they're likely to survive Sacrifice, depending on how you've calibrated it. But realistically, this just means that you're using them in a sort of last-ditch measure where you're trying to like blow up the enemy with Sacrifice. And it's just a kind of nice bonus that some of your Vigilises might survive it, as opposed to your lighter ships, which would all die from the Sacrifice as well. So a little bit there, but not really much. Resurrection is where you're probably going to actually be using this. Regardless of the situation, these guys do tend to sort of like push towards the enemy front lines just because you're probably going to want them as close to the enemy missile ships, which are way like in the back there. If your opponent is sort of arranged in one way or another, they're probably going to have like a set of frontline ships over here, like their corvettes or whatever, or their frigates. Then they're going to have like their capital ships, and then they're going to have their long-range missile ships. And you want these guys to be within range of their long-range missile ships so that they're shooting at the missiles right as they come out of the barrel. That's the most optimal way to shoot at missiles. And if you have that going on, your Vigilises are actually probably like standing straight on top of your enemy frigates. Which means that anything that's not getting microed, that's not getting like specifically targeted, is going to be shooting at these guys most likely because they'll be the closest target to them. The end result of that is that even if your opponent's like kind of paying attention most of the time, Vigilises can take some damage or some casualties just from that happening. Even though if your opponent is like purely killing just Vigilises, they're so tough and they're so like inconsequential to sort of the battle by the time you've actually done enough damage to their backline ships. And they have no way to actually protect those guys. Like you can't actually block for your backliners really. In that particular case, the Vigilises probably by the time they're all dead, your opponent's lost all their backline and they've probably lost the fight anyway. So your resurrection is kind of important for these guys just because you're likely to lose a bunch of them, whatever it is you're fighting against. But ideally, if you're playing Vigilises, you're playing a fairly defensive style where you're not losing too many ships there. So this would mostly be recovering from a bad fight or a situation where you messed up a little bit, primarily speaking. Now for Advent Wrath, you've actually got more interesting choices there. Chastise has some interesting effects there. If you've got enough Vigilises to just about deal with the enemy missiles, like you're getting overwhelmed but not too badly, You can pop Chastise, and it'll make it so that for a brief period, your Vigilises will like start destroying like wave after wave after wave of missiles much more efficiently because they're getting bunched up, and your opponent's going to have like an entire minute where their missiles are just sort of crawling towards you. And they're going to end up with like a compressed wave that's going to be really scary later, but for now, that's going to make it so that your Vigilises are keeping up on things. During that time, you can have your other forces like completely destroy a whole bunch of the enemy missile ships and get to the point where you can sort of catch up a little bit with your Vigilises, to the point where you can sort of deal with the wave as it is and let only a little bit through, and then after that, hopefully you've caught to the point where your missile anti-missile capacity has reached the point where it's sort of equalized to the enemy missile ships that are remaining. Basically, you have a huge slow from Chastise against enemy missiles and strike craft, which makes it way easier to shoot them down. So that's kind of the reason that you would go that route there. The other one is Fury. If you reduce the hit points of a whole ton of enemy light ships by enough, then the Vigilises can finish them off really effectively. But generally speaking, I would say that that's not ideal for these guys. They should just be winning those sort of fights usually anyway. But they can definitely make it easier on you as well. The last one for the Advent Wrath that I'd say is important is the Avatar ability, and this one I'd say is the best one for them. Increasing all of their damage by 30% is absolutely crazy good, making it so that they're doing ridiculously high damage against the targets that they're firing at, but also so that they're doing a bunch more damage against things like heavy missiles or against Vasari heavy strike craft. Combine that with Fury of the Unity, and you're looking at a total of like 80% extra damage, 86% extra damage off these guys. It's enough that they're capable of like really blowing up a lot of missiles and a lot of strike craft. It's something where you would just basically not have to worry about those sort of things anymore, even if you've got relatively small Vigilis numbers. But obviously you would want like a decent amount to sort of benefit from that if you're doing that route. And if you're really, really behind on point defense, you can pop both Chastise and you can pop Avatar at the same time. And this would help you get through potentially something really scary, like a wave of missiles from like a Marza or something like that, that could potentially deal with a significant chunk of that in a way that you wouldn't normally be able to do. Now, you're still going to want to move out of the radius, obviously, but being able to sort of counteract a good chunk of those missiles is something that you normally would not be able to do, even if you have very good point defense. Anyway, that's pretty much everything there is to say about the Vigilis. I think it's a heavily underrated ship. I really like it. I like the fact that it is such an awkward ship to properly counter, and such an expensive ship to counter effectively, so it kind of forces your opponent away from just going for those huge numbers of missiles. I really think that this is one of those ships that you should give a try if you're playing as the Advent there. Obviously, if you are taking these guys, though, you do need to have other damage dealers that can sort of take up the place of those Vigilises. I think that they work really, really well if you're playing as Advent Wrath and you've got the Oblivias out. At that point in time, these guys are just making it so that the Oblivias can't get killed because a lot of the stuff that wants to shoot at them are things like missiles. And it makes your capital ships are able to sort of do their job a little bit better. So anyway, that's going to be our video for today. I hope you found this enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.